that we move to the education, right? That we move to, in fact, in education, all we're doing is the same thing. We're making connections in our mind, but we're doing it in a slightly different method. We're doing it more on a more cognitive level. We're not just doing it on a behavioral level. So the sort of the differences, the subcategories are things like dealing with behavior versus dealing with behavior as it's influenced by our brains or cognition, right?
Yeah.
So has it been difficult?
The material, no, I think it's very insightful. I actually like the videos that you post.
Good.
My favorite video that you posted was like the lecture me really about the professor like teaching the lecture class. I don't know why, but I thought it was so funny because I understood the lecture in general. Like I never thought that I could like understand that. Like I'm not trying to bring myself down or anything. It's just that like I didn't know. Um
Well, we saw, well, for the lecture me really was actually the newspaper article. Is that what you mean?
yes.
Okay, good. Yeah, and then the video we saw was Eric Mazur, and he was the one that was doing, he was in front of the class and he was saying, things like, it turns out I wasn't teaching them anything.
Yeah,
Yeah.
which is funny. And I actually related it to me and my cousin's life, because she's she's getting her associate's degree in BMCC and I'm taking like 300 level courses. So I asked her like one day, like, would you be able to do my work or like just read what I have? And she tells me like I'm never gonna understand anything that you do in class. Like one day she was sitting here and she was listening to your lecture and she goes, Carolina, like what are you talking about? Like I can't understand this. So it's kind of funny how she doesn't like comprehend or will comprehend to like a certain degree of what like being taught.
Yeah, no, it's funny when you're teaching. Hey, Erica. It's
Hi.
hi. When you're teaching, you're always teaching to this broad range of people, right? With a broad range of experience, broad range of curiosity. Um, I like to, my idea of teaching science and scientific theory is to not be exclusionary, to try really hard not to use a whole lot of jargon that essentially excludes people that don't know the jargon, even though they would be perfectly able to understand the concepts. It's just that it's often put forth in science in such a way that it's just inaccessible, you
Yeah.
know, and I think it was, what's her name? Oh gosh, the Italian movie star that went to hunt her, Isabella Rossellini.
Yeah, her.
Anyway, she, when she first came, she was taking the master's program in animal behavior, and she wrote this blog entry about why does science writing have to be so boring?
That's
I was like, yes, exactly. I don't know. Um, but I do know now. It's funny. At first I didn't, but after years of reading it, I understand it. I don't understand the exclusionary language, but what I do understand is that scientists have to be extremely specific in explaining things, or
it
they
gets
may,
lost in translation.
it does get lost in translation sometimes. And, but I think that the translation, part of my job is the translation, I think, actually, because um, I want everybody in the room to get something from it. Um, and uh, and I believe they can. And it's funny because I really identify with Eric Mazur because, at this point, I've been teaching a lot of these things for a while. And I understand things that I didn't understand at the beginning. And sometimes I think things are more accessible than they are for that reason. Because because I've been studying it so long, I'm like, oh yeah, I get this. This is fabulous research. And then I realize as students look at it, I realize, oh, no, they haven't done the research beforehand that makes this research look fabulous. So, so, it's an interesting process of trying to make sure that you guys get you know, really up-to-date research, because it's important if you were to go out in the world or to graduate school and start talking about what you've learned about learning, it would be too bad if you weren't sort of aware of the trends that people that study learning are involved in right now, because you would actually make a better impression and probably get into school more easily if you know what's happening in the field of learning. And as you know, from maybe from some of the stuff we've learned, um, that tends to be almost cyclical, right? You know how when I was saying that um, everybody called themselves a behaviorist because they couldn't get published otherwise,
Mhm.
right? And so that's what I mean. It's like if you had come onto the scene then and, you know, not called yourself a behaviorist, people would have said, oh, well, this person doesn't know what's up. And so we're trying to kind of do both learning the history and kind of learning where people are now and what people are studying now. And I also always try and get the sort of the smartest minds working, because if you only have a limited amount of time, you might as well look at the smartest minds. Just makes sense.
Yeah.
That's what, of course, Dehaene is. You know, I was listening to him earlier. Hey, okay. Thanks about the message for about Anasia, and hi, Yvette. Um, yeah, I realized today when I was talking to students that Dehaene is quite young, and he is in all sorts of areas. I really, I don't know. I would think he's going to win a Nobel. I'd be surprised if he doesn't. So, you know, take me up on that bet. We'll see. Um, Hi, I'm seeing more and more people, and yes, sure enough, it's 3:44. Um, I got your email, Kelly. You're not in California right now, are you?
Not yet.
But I like you're wearing that sort of California motivation or intention shirt.
I made
Like,
this.
or you did? Cool.
Yeah, during quarantine.
Pandemic tie-dye.
I did like
Yay.
20 of them.
I love it.
They were all sold out, like all the Walmarts and everything. They were like, oh no, everyone took all of our tie-dye kits when it hit.
God, you can imagine people wandering around.
Yeah, everyone's got
all these various tie-dyes. I can see it now.
My little sister and I had to do bleach tie-dye because we couldn't find regular tie-dye at Walmart over the summer. So I feel you.
That's super cool though.
Oh God. Well, bleach tie-dye is fun too. I've actually done bleach tie-dye.
It looks a little cooler in person for sure.
Oh, coolness. The pandemic. Do we still have to be cool? I don't know. Maybe we could give that up for now. Just when we go back out on the street, we have to be cool, which is always like, I went on the subway the other day. I'm like, oh my God, I'm going into New York City. What should I wear? I used to go in like every day, but hey. All right, nothing that stretches, I say. Okay, so here we are. Couple syllabus sort of updates. We are not meeting on the 25th of November, which is a Wednesday, but it's one of these Wednesdays that has a Friday schedule. So we're not going to meet then. We are meeting on the 13th and the 24th. The class this morning wanted to make the 24th a work session, so I am certainly offering it to you. So you would have the 13th and the 24th. Hopefully that would mean that you would have everything done for your presentation before you went home for Thanksgiving, or even if you don't go home, before you go on the Thanksgiving vacation, holiday, whatever it's called now. Anyway, so do you think that you would like that? Question mark. You can do thumbs up, you can shake your head, whatever kind of way you'd like to communicate yes or no on this one. Oh, we can chat too. I got a yes, I got one yes. 2 yeses, 3, okay. I think it's going in the yes direction here. Obviously, if you get here and you finish, then you don't have to stay. But I really think it'll give you a chance to maybe run through stuff, just feel good about it, leave it here, come back on the first and present. This year is finishing a lot faster. It's like, whoa, wait a minute. It's almost, what happened? All right, it happens every year, I guess, but it's a little different this year. All right, so in terms of the paper on the influence of emotion on learning and memory, I will get you 5 study questions this weekend. It is a really long paper, but it does really cover the waterfront in terms of emotion and how it interacts with learning and memory. It's really well done. And please note that, by the way, this team is from a university in Malaysia, which is kind of, I think, interesting. And it is, in fact, edited by a woman in the Netherlands. Right, so there's the Netherlands, there's Denmark is in the Netherlands, and are both here. So this is a truly international paper, which I also find I like for you guys to see, because it's not all things done, at Harvard. There's a lot of really important work done elsewhere. It's good to know. Okay, so now we're going to finish up this this movie, and it won't take us the full class time, I don't think, judging from my earlier class. If we want to just quickly jump back and take a couple of review questions, the first question I want to ask you is, I swear this initial is so hard to remember. I don't know why, but what does VWFA stand for?
It's the visual word form area.
What's that?
Sorry, I said it's the visual word form area.
Jocelyn, you are totally correct. All right, so it's the visual word form area. What's that visual word form area, the result of evolution?
No.
No.
No. Excellent. Good answer. No. And is there anything, why did you answer no? What did they tell us about it that lets us know it's not? Or what did Stanislaw tell us?
Because there's no good evolutionary reason that we would need to recognize words, basically.
Yeah.
It's not going to promote reproduction.
Exactly. There's no, I think, what do they say? There's no natural pressure. There's no pressure for natural selection that would motivate natural selection to take place. And so he called it something called a cultural object. So what did he mean by a cultural object? I mean, one of the things is that it is not it's not formed through evolution. That's one of the things. But what is a cultural object in terms of when we're thinking about reading? There's no really right answer. I don't have anything specific in mind. So you can go ahead and guess.
Can you repeat the question one more time?
Kelly knows to do this, and it's just she also knows how incredibly difficult that is for me. But okay, the question is, so when Stanislaw Dehaene talks about reading as a cultural object versus a genetic object, what kind of characterizes that? Okay, I obviously have not asked this question in a way that it is in fact clear in any way. So let me try, let me try here. All right, so what it is reading does not have its own organ, right? The VWFA is in fact, what it is the visual word form area, but what is it in terms of like a part of the brain? It's not a specific part of the brain. It was, what is let me get this, I think we can work backwards from this. What was his theory? The theory that he proposed and is talking about in this video.
It was the neuronal recycling theory.
It was. So the reason I said we can work back from that is, right, there were no specific neurons in the brain for reading, right? We had mechanisms to understand speech. We had mechanisms to understand words, to comprehend the meanings of words, but we didn't have an interface with the visual, with the occipital what's the word, capabilities. So what happened? Neuronal recycling, it's kind of, what is that? Does anybody want to say really briefly? You don't have to go deep into it, but what does he mean by neuronal recycling?
Is it that evolutionary objects in the brain were invaded by cultural, like language?
Right. In fact, I think that an even easier, more biological way to say it is, in fact, some neurons were hijacked for this purpose, right? And, or repurposed, maybe is the best way to say it, right?
Right.
Those neurons were neurons that had all the capabilities that we needed to read. If you remember, they were neurons that were mainly involved in like facial recognition, and I believe form recognition, place recognition before, but they had been repurposed to read. And this is in fact his hypothesis, right? It is not like fact. It is what he believes, in that, supported by this discovery of this VWFA that lights up every time someone is reading, right? In across every culture, across every person they tested, the same area lit up. So that, or is activated, that's what it means by lit up. So that alone makes one think, oh, so in all these humans who learn to read, it is being processed in this place that they've now called the VWFA, right? That must mean, but that place was already in the brain doing something else. So this is the explanation that he came up with, that we're listening to him talk about now. Does that make sense? Good, okay, excellent. Sense has been made. Good, we're working forward. All right, so let's go and listen. I'm gonna go back to like maybe 2 minutes back, and we're going to then move into section 3, which is shorter. I'm just going to give you, read you the questions from section 3. How are neurons involved in forming words? Are those single neurons or populations of neurons? What is the bigram coding hypothesis? And does Dehaene's work support teaching children to read with the whole word method or the sounds and letters method? Listen carefully to this one because it is easy to misinterpret what he's saying, both through heavy accent and also the fact that he gets very worked up because he's talking about the education of his son. So he becomes really passionate about how they're doing it all wrong, and it's harder to understand him. So those are your questions. Let me go find that movie, the video.
There is a visual area, a visual word form area, because that cortex, first of all, in all primates, likes to see line configurations, and therefore, this is the best cortex in order to learn to read. Okay, it's one of the biases that are present probably quite early on in this cortical region that makes it adequate to learn to read. There are probably other biases in this region. There is a general preference of the lateral cortex for high level of detail inside the fovea, the high resolution region of the retina, and of course we need that for reading. And finally, the fact that it is in the left hemisphere is probably because that projects quite directly to the language areas of the brain. There are very short connections to the lateral temporal lobe regions that are important for language understanding, as I showed at the beginning. So all together, we can understand why there is a visual word form area at a reproducible location. It's not that there is an organ for reading. This region never evolved for reading, but it has a number of biases that together make a particular spot of cortex optimal, in a certain sense, for acquiring this particular function. We are beginning to speculate now as to how single neurons in this area might be involved in coding individual words. Now, for faces, it's beginning to be understood that neurons are forming a sort of hierarchy. This is actually a model by Shimon Ullman. Now, there is increasing evidence for that at the physiological level in the monkey, that at the bottom you have really a preference for just a few segments of the image, but as you climb the pyramid, you have conjunctions of neurons that together might detect the corner of the eye, for instance, and if you put them together, you have neurons that respond to the region of the eyes, and if you put them together, you begin to have neurons that respond to the profile of a face, and you put them together, you can have neurons that respond to a face regardless of the orientation in which the animal sees it. Well, we think it's exactly the same for reading, so this is now a speculative model of what could be happening for reading at the neural level. At the bottom, all you have is line detectors in area V1. As you climb the pyramid, you may have detection of conjunctions of lines forming a T pattern, for instance. If you put them together, you can have neurons that respond to a specific letter, now in a specific view, but if you go to the next level, you can recognize a letter regardless of the font or in the case in which it is presented. And if you put these neurons together, you may have neurons that respond to a conjunction of several letters, such as E left of N. This would be a bigram detector, a detector of two letters in a specific order. And if you put them together, you begin to have neurons that respond to fragments of words, morphemes, prefixes, suffixes, and finally, perhaps you have a neural code for the whole word. I want to insist that at any of these levels, we don't think that neurons are ever coded by, that words are ever coded by a single neuron. Words are always coded by a population of neurons, but the population becomes more and more abstract and independent of the specifics of the display and more pertinent for recognizing which words it is, regardless of the case and font. So that's a model, but this model has a lot to say for it, and we've done several tests of it. One test involves presenting subjects in the fMRI scanner with stimuli that are designed to activate hierarchically higher levels of the model. So we start with false font stimuli that are not even letters, then very rare letters that should not be very well coded, then more frequent letters in French, but you see the combinations are not frequent at all, like Q followed by O is impossible in French. Here we have frequent bigrams that should activate these bigram neurons, but the quadrigrams, the set of 4 letters, are still impossible. Here the quadrigrams are possible, and in fact this could be a word. I think it looks like the name of a medicine, perhaps, here. We have an automatic medicine name generator, we could sell it. But, and finally you have the real words here. Okay. Well, you can see in these images very briefly that we get more and more anterior activation, exactly as the model predicts, as we go through this hierarchy of stimuli here. The activation really moves forward, and that's the case only in the left hemisphere, in the left ventral pathway here. So what we've called the visual word form area is probably separated into several clusters of neurons that respond to different properties, and we're still trying to resolve that at the single subject level. This is a group image, so it's smoothed by averaging across many subjects. At the individual subject, we believe there might be patches of neurons that respond to these properties. Another great thing about this bigram hypothesis is it can explain some of the emails you've been receiving. I think many of you know about this email. Maybe I'll let you read it. It's amazing that you can read it, actually, but I think you can. It's a bit slow, but yeah, it speaks about research in Cambridge. It's funny, at that time there was no such research in Cambridge, actually, but now there is. So I'll just focus on the last sentence, which says, "This is because the human mind does not read every letter by itself, but the word as a whole." Well, that's not true. If we are correct, and already there is a lot of evidence, the brain processes the letters. And it's not because it's reading words as a whole that you can read this message. In fact, that's ridiculous, because by scrambling the letters, you're scrambling the shape of the whole word, and yet you can still read it to some extent. So what's happening here? Well, we think what's happening is that there is bigram coding. So imagine that you take a word like badge, okay? And the way it is coded at the neural level is by the pairs of its letters. So something like the sum of all of the pairs of the letters here. Now, what's special about this text is that the first and the last letter are always at the correct position. By doing that, you're preserving an enormous number of the bigrams. Okay. And we can show in the laboratory, and this has been done by Granger and collaborator, that it's exactly the proportion of preserved bigrams that can explain how well you can read this text. You've noticed that you're slower than usual, but if you can read it, it's because the bigram code is sufficiently similar to the one that you have for known words. Okay. And for instance, maybe you've not even noticed that this word is misspelled, right? There's one pair of letters has been swapped, but that's not enough to change the inner code in your brain for this particular orthographic pattern. So this bigram coding still is a hypothesis. Nobody has seen a neuron that responds to a pair of letters. We cannot see single neurons at the moment in a human brain, except in very exceptional situations. But we think it's a valid hypothesis, like the neutrino. Maybe one day we'll be able to see it, and it will be a great day, of course. We think that this sort of data can speak to some of the classical debates in education, and in particular this notion of whole word versus phonics, teaching and reading. Should we teach using presentation of the whole word, or should we teach using specific teaching of the letter to sound correspondences? Well, there is a lot of arguments for the whole word method, actually, and I have to say that the whole word notion actually comes from psychologists at the beginning of the 20th century. For instance, one of their arguments was that reading is extremely fast. It seems to be almost instantaneous, so it has to be that it's using the whole shape of the word, not the individual letters. In fact, the time to read a word in any one of you in this room is independent of the number of letters. There's a flat curve from 3 letters to 8 letters. You have the same speed of reading. So these findings gave people, and psychologists in particular, the illusion of whole word reading. Okay. But we know better now, and I'd like to argue that this is not evidence at all. We think we know now that the brain is making use of every single letter, but what's happening is that it's treating them in parallel. And in fact, this is not true even of young children. So these curves here are showing you the reading times for different grades of children. And as I told you, adults would be at the bottom here, and they would be flat. That is to say, the number of letters in the word has no influence on your reading time from 2 to 5 here. But you see that for young beginning readers, of course, it's much more serial. They have to read perhaps not letter by letter, but quite serially, taking small packets of letter at a time, right? So in them, certainly, there is no whole word reading at all. It's serial. Second, even in the adult brain, we think that the brain still relies on letters. All of the priming studies have been showing you are based on individual letters being processed. What is happening is a concept that was not available at the beginning of the 20th century, is this notion of parallel processing. All of the letters are processed at once. That's why there is this flat curve, okay? Because there are millions of neurons that are doing the job, and each one of them is seeing small local evidence, maybe about one letter, but they all work in parallel together, and so it gives this illusion of whole word reading. So these sort of exercises, which actually this comes from my son's book when he was learning to read, where you have to match the shape of the word to a specific shape of upper and lower going consonants and vowels, is ridiculous. It has nothing to do with the way the brain processes the letters, and I don't think it's useful at all for the child. But I was pleased to see that all of these arguments, which come from the way the brain works in especially adult readers, fit very well with educational evidence, which suggests that if you just compare teaching methods and find which ones are teaching the fastest, the teaching of systematic grapheme to phoneme correspondences is apparently has the upper hand in making the fastest change in the child's brain. I want to emphasize that there is no evidence that the whole word method is creating dyslexia. Sometimes people say it's creating dyslexia. It's not true. Dyslexia is a biological, genetic impairment. But what the whole word method is creating is a delay in teaching. That's very clear in the available educational data. And we think it's because it's not matching very well the way the brain does it. The brain really needs to focus on the individual letters, initially serially, and progressively much more in parallel. Okay. In fact, there is a beautiful experiment by my colleague Bruce McCandless in which he's taken adults and he's showing them a new artificial orthography, which consists of connecting letters, but half of the subjects he's not telling them that they are letters. Okay, he's telling them this is a sort of shape, okay, and it looks like a shape, and you have to learn it. It maps onto a word. Okay, and the other groups, the other group of subjects, he tells them they are letters and they map onto words. This is the only difference, and then the subjects are exposed to exactly the same stimuli, and they have to learn every day 30 of these words. But the difference is enormous. One group, which is learning the letters to sound correspondences, is learning. The other is learning much, much more slowly. The group with whole word teaching is not learning to generalize to novel words. And at the brain level, and perhaps most interestingly, the group which is learning by trying to memorize the whole shape of the word is having increasing activation, not in the left visual word form area, but in the right hemisphere visual word form area. And I find this extremely interesting, that perhaps just by misorienting the child's attention or the adult's attention, we might be training the wrong side of the brain, in a certain sense, or the wrong brain area, and therefore delaying the acquisition of the appropriate expertise in the appropriate brain site. As we saw, it's always in the same location in every reader who has achieved expertise, so we might as well focus the learning early on this particular brain area. So that's it for the whole word versus phonics.
All right. How do we answer some of these questions then? He kind of handles a couple pretty complex and important pieces of, well, what he's using to support his hypothesis. So he started off right where we ended our review, which is, why the VWFA is where it is, and the fact that it's not an organ that evolved. So how are neurons involved in forming words? And is it single neurons or population of neurons? Populations of neurons.
Population.
Mm-hmm. And Erica, can you expand that to talk about, you may not be able to, and you can say no, to talk about how neurons are involved in forming words?
So he sort of explains that there aren't single neurons that will look at a word, that it's more like pairings, and we'll look at pairings of letters, and then there's this sort of hierarchical process similar to like how we learn about eyes and faces and like our sight classes that end up processing the words from there.
Yes, yes, very good. Yeah, it goes from, he always talks about V1, right? So V1 is the first visual cortex, and then there's V1, I believe, up to 7 at least at this point. So there are different steps, but he talks about, in V1, you're just seeing perhaps the lines, and then you're seeing the conjunctions, and then perhaps you're seeing the letter, and then maybe you're seeing the bigram, which I think, Erica, is what you were talking about. So that's my timer, excuse me. So moving right from that, so what is this bigram coding hypothesis? Is there any additional information anybody can throw onto that?
Sure. He talked about there are different clusters of neurons that detect different aspects and properties of the letter. Like he talked about line junctions. He talked about what else? Line detectors. And there's again that hierarchy, and those are taken in at the same time by these different clusters. So
Right,
yeah.
right. And what kind of processing is that called?
Let me see.
Is it called, I'm sorry, is it called
Yeah.
parallel processing?
It's parallel.
Yeah.
Yeah, parallel processing, exactly.
It's like all the letters are being like processed at once, I believe.
Exactly, right? So there's no like controversy about the brain's ability to do parallel processing. And do you remember how he kind of supported the idea that they were processed in terms of that all the letters were happening at the same time? He supported it with a graph. What was that graph showing us?
Was showing us that the rate of us being able to read words that contain 3 to 8 letters was about the same.
Yes, exactly. As we became adults, right? So first graders are going to learn it serially, meaning letter by letter, or letter or bigram by bigram. But we, on the other hand, would be processing it all at the same time. Now, one of the things that's really interesting about the whole bigram idea is that, so he talks about it as a code, which is interesting. Earlier, before class, we were talking about scientific writing, and I was saying, well, they have to write it in that sort of really boring, jargonish way because they have to be very, very specific. So when a scientist uses a word like code, they mean something very specific. So what is code in terms of computers? Well, code is, binary code, and we just happen to be talking about bigrams. So there's a little parallel there. The other thing is that most code is kind of like statistical in nature, meaning that the code has been developed based on the probability of which letters going to come next, and which letters actually form bigrams. And those bigrams, yes, have that hierarchical, this is the most likely, this is the second most likely, and that's how we understand words or come to interpret words. So did you notice he mentioned our friend Bruce McCandless? I actually chose this video, I chose McCandless way before I chose Dehaene. I had no idea that they were like colleagues, but it tells us one thing, is that this research community is small. So I don't know if you've watched McCandless yet, but I think that having listened to Dehaene here, it will deepen your understanding of what McCandless is doing and what he's trying to bring into schoolrooms. All right. Let's see. Anybody else have any questions on that area? We will otherwise go into our fourth area.
What about the way he felt about whole word and sound and
Yes, thank you, Kelly. I'm like, I've got so many notes on my paper, I can't even see my questions anymore. Okay, so all right, yes, does he support the whole word or the sounds and letters method?
Wasn't he mentioning something about like how his son is learning like with phonics or something? Like he thought that it wasn't working for his son to like learn something. Like it's slower. I don't know.
Yeah. Carolina, you're right. I mean, yes, there's some blank spots in that, but yes, absolutely. He is talking about he's using Brandon, I see that. I'm going to read it in a minute. He is using the example from his son's book, right? That really silly example of those like this shape of the word, and he's like, come on, that has no meaning whatsoever. And you have to admit, do you really want to be the teacher of this guy's son? Can you imagine the teacher coming in and saying, this is useless. This has nothing to do with what the neurons do. And you're like, oh, okay. I don't know what neurons do. Anyway, Brandon says, he said the whole word is much slower and trains the wrong part of the brain. Yes, exactly, Brandon. It changed. In fact, they noticed like a shift of some of the focus going to the right part of the brain, and the right part of the brain is, in fact, the right hemisphere is not in the hemisphere where language tools are, like the left. And so his contention is that by doing that, you are simply delaying, by changing or misfocusing children, learners, focusing the neuronal activity, you're delaying the learning. You're not like making it impossible to learn. He's not saying that, nor is he saying that you are in fact creating, what was that he was talking about? Dyslexia. But he's saying you are slowing it down. And he used McCandless's experiment to illustrate that. Thank you, Kelly, for bringing that up. Yeah, Erica.
I wonder, does he do research on the right side of the brain also? Because he kind of skipped over that and mentioned it as sort of like teaching the wrong side, but how does he know?
Oh, he knows, but he knows by what we know about the right side of the brain. And the main way, the easiest way for us to get into what he knows is that it is on the left side of the brain that we have Wernicke's and Broca's area. So it would make sense that reading comprehension would be in an area that had easy access to our Wernicke's area and Broca, our language areas. So that was the most example, the clearest example. The right side of the brain, I think McCandless has research that shows that children who look at words and the right side of their brain gets activated are going to take longer to learn to read than children that the left side becomes activated. So there's been a little bit of research of that. Interesting. Do you have like an interest in the right side of the brain and that's why you brought that up, or?
No, I'm just wondering because it kind of reminded me of how bilingual children also learn slower. So I'm wondering if slower means worse.
Oh, means worse?
Or
yeah.
Because he's sort of implying that slower is worse. I'm wondering if slower actually means worse, and if he has like other data that other research that he's done to show that. I'll just look it up. It's okay. I'll just look it up.
No, it's fine. No, Erica, that's interesting. So I think he is. I didn't hear him say worse. I heard him say slower.
No, he didn't say worse.
Yeah. So I don't think so. And in terms of bilingual, remember how when we first started talking about this, we had that example where the VWFA only lights up if you read something that is your native language kind of thing. And I think during that time, we talked a little bit about bilingual, and I still don't know. There was this presidential election, so I didn't have a chance to look up the, but anyway, but I still don't know. And it still interests me because it would seem that there may be some repetition of mechanisms or functions here that in fact would take more time. So I understand why you have that question, because I think bilingual, there's a lot of research on bilingual learning, as you probably know, and really interesting research, by the way. And I'm sure somewhere in there, there's right brain, left brain stuff in terms of learning to read. Learning to read in 2 languages, I don't know. So bilingual, does that mean that you can read in 2 languages or simply that you can speak 2 languages? I think it's speaking. I have a feeling it's speaking, but anyway, moving on. Good question.
One more question about it.
Of course.
So he said his son was learning how to read and that's how they were teaching him. Like how old would his son have been if that's how they were teaching him how to read, do you think? Like what stage?
Right. Reading.
So I'm trying to understand, like, I guess that would, I don't know.
Reading gets taught a little later than other skills because it is so complex, because it has, the visual and the language parts. I have a couple interesting chats here. Apparently, did you see, Erica did see that about Ellen Bialystok. Okay, now, people with children, tell me when your children were taught to read. Does anybody know?
It depends on their education. Some kids learn in like daycare, so as early as 3. Some kids skip it and start learning like at 4 or 5. If
That's
they're
what
like really
4 or
late at
5 was what I would have guessed there. Yvette?
I mean, because I work with early head start, early learn, I don't think we really teach them how to read in 3K or pre-K, but I would say like 5 when they're in kindergarten, maybe pre-K, because I know that the pre-K teacher, teaches them how to write their name. So, well, I'll say 5, just to be on the safe side.
Well, it's interesting that the idea, because remember how he mentioned that at 2 months, the baby's sort of language understanding, kind of the parts of their brain were already organized in a way that would simply be added onto in the adult. So it was already sort of reminiscent of the adult organization. So you think, yeah, maybe they are trying to teach earlier, because in fact, there is evidence that they have perhaps the skills, certainly in the spoken area at that point.
I actually have a question. Wouldn't it be better to teach a kid how to read like at the age of 3 than at the age of 5 before they go to school? I don't have any kids, but I'm just saying.
Well, the better thing is tricky, because theories of education, and I am not a early education, expert, but think about our Piaget work, right? So the idea of the concept, and Bruner and so forth, the concept of readiness, right? So the idea is that a brain has to have developed to a certain level to be able to handle the complexity that is necessary for learning to read. And so I think that most educational paths are based on some understanding, or at least theory, about the development of the brain, right? And they make the choice of when to teach it from when they think that the child's brain will be most ready to process that information. I think that's how it's decided. And I know there are different ideas. Certainly, there are parents that will tell you, right, oh, my kid was reading, in the cradle. And you're like, okay, right. But but there are different theories, and there are certainly theories. Bruner believed that essentially you could teach anybody anything at any age. So there are going to be different, and of course, people send different preschools like Montessori, and the different theories of learning and the Rudolf, is it Steiner School? And so there's a lot of different theories of learning, and kids get taught reading at different ages according to those theories. I hope that was a good answer. It was certainly broad. Okay, so any other questions? I cannot. I think that I read Stolz-Niasen, Alexander Stolz-Niasen when I was, 5. But anyway, kidding, totally kidding. I think my parents may have given me that book when I was 5, but I did not read it then. So this is a big fat book. All right, moving on. So let's go to the last part. And here are our questions for section 4. What is mirror writing, and do adults do it? What letters do we have trouble identifying, pronouncing as a leftover from mirror writing, the mirror writing stage? In the section that deals with the literacy experiments, which will be the last section, what demonstrates the direct relationship between something you've learned and brain activation? And we'll see that, we'll see if that is demonstrated. Then next question, if neuronal recycling created the VWFA, why would that recycling create what he calls a cognitive competition between the recognition of words and the recognition of faces? We have a little bit of that answer already. There are changes in the brain's anatomy as a result of learning to read. What are they? I'm going to make a quick comment now. So, the very fact that there are changes in the brain's anatomy as a result of learning to read is interesting in that this is not neuroplasticity, this is not genetic, but rather from a cultural behavioral practice, the brain has been changed, right? And we know it's the purpose of certain neurons in the brain. But it's interesting to note that the changing of the brain does not have to happen on a genetic level. Okay. And let me make sure all the chats are answered. Yes, all chats are answered. All right. And share screen. Okay, Stanislaw.
Debate, but a lot of pages of my book are dedicated to this idea, so you can look in there for more details. I want to try to explain another puzzle of reading acquisition, which occurred actually in one of my children, and I was really puzzled by it at the beginning, but I think many of you have seen this. Here is a child, the child of an Italian friend actually, who has signed his drawing, and you can see that the name is written from right to left. The child is called Leon. Okay. And it's quite frequent at the early stage of writing that children will write from right to left instead of from left to right. They will not notice it. Here is another child. It's even more impressive, actually. This child has written Theodore ti voglio bene. Okay? Which means Theodore loves you, and it's written in so-called boustrophodon, as the ox plows in a field. This is exactly the way ancient Greek was written. One line in one direction, the other line in the other direction, like this. Okay. The child has invented it and does not notice that there is a problem. This is not the right way to do it. It's amazing, right? Nobody has taught any of these children to write in the wrong direction, from right to left, and nobody has taught them to read in this way, and yet they don't seem to have any problem with that. So what's happening? It's present in all children. This is an old experiment, 85. There are not so many experiments in this domain, but this is a nice one. If you have young children, you can try this. It's a way to elicit this behavior. You ask children to write their names next to a dot, okay? So you can see that here the two children have no problem, Lissy and Maggie. But now you place the dot on the right side of the page, and there is a problem, of course. And Maggie is the older child, and see, she's managing to start a little bit on the left and to squeeze all of the letters, and okay, she's written her name. Lissy has no problem at all. She starts here and she writes from right to left, okay? And when you do this, 90% of the children write from right to left at a certain age. And you can see this as a function of age. There is a peak at about 5 or 6 years, and then it drops, okay? So it's not dyslexia, it's something that's generic about the child. What is it? Well, I think it might be something like the panda's thumb of reading, a sort of sequel of our evolution. We all can recognize these two faces as being the same face, even though they are mirror images of each other. On your retina, they are projecting as completely different stimuli, but your brain is able to tell you immediately that they are the same. Okay? We have a mechanism that has evolved in a world where there is gravity, but there is not much reason to discriminate left or right. We have evolved a mechanism of generalization of object recognition across mirror images. And it's now been seen even at a single neuron level. But of course, it's a problem for reading, because these stimuli might be completely different words. We have letters like D's and B's, which are mirror images, and yet they are different letters. They are not the same object. So there is a lot of evidence that our memory is insensitive to left and right orientation. You look at these stimuli, you look at these pictures, and you've never seen them before, actually. You think you recognize them, but they're all wrong. They're all reversed, right? There is a lot of evidence that even babies will do this. In the first year of life, there is a nice experiment by Borstein and collaborators, 1978, where babies generalize to the mirror image of an object that they've been exposed to. Inferotemporal neurons do this. If you record neurons in a monkey and you expose them to this sort of stimuli, you'll see that the profiles of firing of the neurons are very similar to left and right mirror images, but much less similar to top-down mirror images, as you can see here. And there is an amazing experiment by Nikos Logothetis where he trains the monkeys with shapes like this. And during the training, the monkey only sees one particular view of this three-dimensional shape. So he's trained really with narrow angles around this particular shape. And then suddenly you look for generalization, and amazingly, the same neuron fires here, as you can see, to the exact mirror symmetrical view. It's after rotation by 180 degrees, it's almost the mirror image view. Right? So there are neurons that really care about mirror images in the brain, and we've done this experiment to try to see whether it's true also in a human brain. So we did this experiment with words and also with pictures. And the idea is based on repetition priming. I explained that yesterday in some detail. We can repeat the same image twice, and then what we see at the brain level is a reduction in activation. But then we can ask, does this count as a repetition as well? Will we see the same sort of reduction in activation when we repeat an image, but now it's in mirror image, right? We can do that with words as well, and so now this is the mirror image of the word piano. Well, the finding is that there is priming in mirror image for pictures at this location, but not at all for words in an adult who has learned to read. It seems really that we have unlearned in this area this mirror image generalization. So you see the signal from this visual word form area. It still is responsive to pictures. In fact, pictures are very complex here, so there's a lot of response, but you see this priming, which is just as much for the exact repetition as there is for the mirror image of the picture. But for words, you get a lot of repetition priming for the exact repetition, but not at all when you present the mirror image. You've completely lost this ability to recognize mirror images. And what's really remarkable is that the peak of this generalization across mirror images for pictures is the same as the peak of the visual word form area. We don't completely understand this coincidence, but it seems to mean that we are trying to learn to read with exactly the area which is giving you maximal mirror image generalization. So it's not a wonder that children have a problem, also that they have a competence for mirror image reading and writing, because that's what their brain tells them, that a B and a D are exactly the same object, and they have to unlearn that. I'd like to close in the last 3 minutes by telling you about the latest study we've done with a lot of collaborators in Brazil and in Portugal to look directly at how the brain is being changed by literacy. This was a very interesting set of experiments that involved scanning of illiterate people and trying to compare them with the brain of people who have been to school, like all of you in this room. There are many questions we can ask in this situation. The first one is, would like to see what is being changed in the brain of literate people. Is it just this visual word form area, or are there also other changes at the low visual level? We can finally ask the great question of evolution. What stimuli activate this area before you've learned to read? And therefore, we can ask, do we lose, do we gain when we learn to read? Is there a form of cortical competition with what is being represented before we learn to read in this region? And we can also ask, do the same changes occur when adults learn to read? This is a nice painting I saw in Sevilla, actually. It's, you can see that this is Virgin Mary, and she's learning to read. Saint Anne is teaching her. This was an advertisement by the church, one of the earliest advertisements. It was an advertisement for women to learn to read. And so, of course, if Virgin Mary can do it, why not me? But the question is, what change is happening, because Virgin Mary is learning quite late here. Is it still possible for a brain to change? Will the same brain areas change when she's learning as an adult, or is there a sort of critical period here? So we did fMRI, and we also have ERP recordings in many groups of subjects. We had pure illiterates from Brazil, young people who just didn't have the chance to go to school, and even as adults remain completely illiterate, unable to recognize half of the letters of the alphabet. Then we had what we call ex-illiterates in Brazil and Portugal, people who had never been to school, but they were able to learn to read during adulthood, and they finally reached a certain level of reading. Never an excellent level, but there was a lot of variability. And finally, we had literate subjects of different groups. Some were perfectly matched to the original groups of illiterate subjects, and others were high-level literates like you in this room. So you can see that we have a lot of variability. These are the 6 groups of subjects, and this is their reading speed. And of course, the illiterates are here. They have 0 reading speed, and then you can see that reading speed is really as a continuous variable here as a function of the expertise of the subjects. The ex-illiterates are here. For some reason, the ex-illiterates from Portugal were not very good readers, and the ones from Brazil were a little bit better readers. But basically what we did then, when we used this variability, you can see that this is accuracy. So now you can see that all of the 5 groups on the right can read to some extent, right? But the reading speed is enormously variable. So we use the variation in reading speed to regress against the brain activation and see which areas correlate with literacy. And the finding, there are many findings. We basically scan them with a very complex protocol that involves spoken language, written language, checkerboards, all sorts of visual stimuli, faces, houses, tools, strings of letters, full fonts, checkers, spoken words, spoken pseudo words. So we have a lot of data here to see what has been changed in our brain. I'll just show you a small sample through this data, especially because time is running short. The first thing we can say is that when we expose these people to sentences flashed 1 word at a time, there is an enormous difference, of course, between those who can and cannot read. It's quite obvious. The main difference is in the visual word form area here. And that really confirms that this area is the primary site of learning. And here you can see the illiterates are at the bottom. This is the response to checkerboards. You can see that initially when you've not learned to read, words are very much like checkerboards, or even worse. And then as you learn to read, this response climbs enormously in this area. So it's really a direct reflection of learning to read. In fact, you can predict about 50% of the variance in reading scores just by looking at the activation in this area. It's the same for young children, by the way. So it's amazing that there is this direct relation between something you've learned and brain activation. The other set of areas are all language areas. You can see that they respond to spoken language. The midpoint here is spoken language. And now the profile is a little bit different. There is no activation by written language unless you've learned to read. And when you've learned to read, the response is about at the same level as with spoken language. So it's quite natural, right? When you learn to read, you learn this interface, the visual area, but you also learn to catch up and to activate all of your spoken language system by vision, as I told you at the beginning. So we can see that at the brain level. Now we can ask, what does the visual word form area do prior to reading? So we look at this site that shows a correlation with reading when we present strings, and we ask, what does it do with all of the other stimuli? You can see that it responds a lot to objects, a lot to faces, not much to houses, a little bit to checkerboards. Most importantly, look at the pink curve, because these are the illiterates. Okay? And you can see that the illiterates are enormously high in faces in this area. And then you can see that it decreases in the other groups. And that's significant. It's not huge, but it's a significant decrease here. So what we have, we seem to have a competition between words and faces in this area. Also, checkers decrease. You can see the illiterates are very high here, and these are the ex-illiterates as well. Interestingly, faces also increase in the right hemisphere. So it's a little bit like faces are pushed out of the left and towards the right. So we see this very significant increase here in response to faces in this right fusiform region. So a change of lateralization of faces because we've learned to read. In fact, it's not like a complete washout of faces out of the left hemisphere. If we look just at the peak for individual subject of responses to faces, we see no change by reading acquisition. And that's the red curve here indicates how much of a literacy effects there is in these successive shells that are centered on the subject-specific peak for faces. So at the peak, there is no change. As you move away from the peak, and of course the face responses decreases by definition, you can see that the literacy effect appears. So what seems to be happening is a shifting of boundaries. Okay. You have a bigger region for faces in illiterates, and the boundary is shifting and shrinking it as people are better and better readers. I don't want to leave you with the idea that reading is bad for the brain, right? That it decreases everything. In fact, we mostly had a positive effect in many areas. And look at these occipital regions, for instance. Here, it's a perfect ordering. The illiterates are at the bottom. And for all of these categories of stimuli, there is an increase in responsivity as a function of the reading score. It seems that there is generalization here, positive generalization, because we learn to discriminate very fine shapes by learning to read, and that generalizes to the other categories. In fact, one of the most spectacular effects was in the primary visual cortex. In the primary visual cortex, we have this response to horizontal checkerboards, which increases with reading scores, and not for vertical checkerboards. What's happening here is that this cortex is retinotopic. It likes specific regions of the retina. And we think that by reading, we're training this horizontal spot of the retina and of the corresponding primary visual cortex to respond stronger, because that's where the words appear. So that's where you need the high-level expertise for fine shapes of words. So this region specifically is increased, and its activation increases and generalizes even to checkerboards, which are not, of course, of the same shapes as letters, but there is generalization. So by learning to read, we train our visual system to make very fine discriminations. Now we have behavioral evidence. It's not on this slide, but we have behavioral evidence that literate subjects are better at curves tracing, which is one ability which depends on the primary visual cortex. Literacy also changes the spoken language system, and that's also a very spectacular finding of that study. We are looking now at responses to spoken language. So this is an area which is called the planum temporale, which is in the left hemisphere here, and it likes to respond to spoken language, but you can see that the response is almost doubled as a function of the reading score, and the good readers are on top here. There is no response to written material in this particular region. It really is a spoken area. It seems to code about phonology, but its response is strongly increased by learning to read, and that's replicated also when we present single words here. We also have top-down activation. So when we present speech, we can see that if the task is a task of auditory lexical decision, then the visual word form area will be activated in a top-down manner, but not when we present just spoken language in a comprehension situation. What is happening here is that when you've learned to read, you have this additional orthographic code, and if you have a difficult auditory task, you seem to recruit it in a top-down manner, and you have this additional code that you can activate optionally in order to make, for instance, this difficult lexical decision. Finally, we can ask, do these effects require early schooling, or are they present in the ex-illiterates when literacy is acquired in adulthood? In fact, all of the previous brain imaging studies of literacy, they confounded schooling and literacy because they compared schooled and non-schooled participants. There is one exception, which is the work of Carreras and collaborators, but it's purely anatomical, and they showed changes in the anatomy of the brain. Now, we separated the two variables by looking at a pure effect of literacy versus a pure effect of early schooling. schooling? And the answer is that all of these effects, or let's say maybe not all, but the vast majority of these effects, including in V1 and planum temporale, can be acquired in adulthood. What we've seen is that the ex-illiterates have the changes in the appropriate direction in all of these areas. Now, of course, the ex-illiterates are not very good readers, and so they don't achieve the same level of reading, and they don't achieve the same level of activation as expert readers in this area. And that's a little bit ambiguous finding. We don't know if with more training, they would reach finally the same level as expert readers. There is no reason to think that they would not, because they're exactly on the same line as the other subjects. And the suggestion, therefore, is that all of these effects can be subject to adult plasticity. There are very famous examples. This work was done in Brazil at the time where there was the presidential election. You might have followed that recently. The candidate that came third in the first round of the presidential election, Marina Silva, was illiterate until the age of 16. And she became a presidential candidate, was very successful, although she didn't quite make it. I would have liked to be able to present the new president. So it shows that you can be illiterate and learn a lot late in life, and that's what we see at the brain level. I think I want to summarize by saying that we begin to understand this miracle of reading that Nabokov was speaking about. We can acquire literacy because, first of all, we inherit a structured and efficient visual recognition system, which is attuned to line junctions and other invariants, both on a genetic basis, but also perhaps because very quickly in the first year of life, it becomes attuned to these features, and we don't really know which is which at the moment. The system is plastic, and it's sufficiently plastic to be partially reoriented towards the particular shapes of written words. But I would also argue that the converse direction is equally true. The cultural systems have been adapted to the brain, and generations of scribes have selected written shapes that fit our brain architecture. We now understand that the visual word form area is not the only area that is being changed by learning to read. The changes induced by literacy go way beyond the visual word form area, and the way they are changed begin to explain a lot of the quirks of this cultural invention. For instance, the fact that mirror reading was possible. In ancient Greece, it was possible to write from left to right and from right to left. This was not a problem at all. It's because I think this area has this property of mirror invariance, and we see it again in our own children. It also begins to clarify, I think, how reading should be taught. Letters and graphemes first, not whole words. And that's the way it works based in education. I'd like to leave you with a final word that I think what I've told you today, I think is the best worked out example of the relation between culture and the brain, but it's not the only example. There are many other examples where this notion of neuronal recycling could be applied, and I'm very interested in the possibility that in mathematics, for instance, we can understand some of the mathematical intuitions and how the brain is changed by cultural symbols like Arabic digits with a similar sort of model. But there is also tool use, art, especially music, perhaps religion, perhaps even spoken language might be to some degree an instance of neuronal recycling. So in the future, I'll be very interested in pursuing these ideas in other domains. And with that, I'll leave you with possibility of further reading, if you'd like. Thank you very much.
That baby picture is pretty good. I have to admit. All right, so let's quickly take a look at, we don't have a lot of time, but we don't have a lot of time because you guys are talking a lot, which is, it's very funny. My morning group never has talked a lot. You guys have always talked a lot. Classes have personalities. I don't know why, they just do. All right, so mirror writing, we certainly talked about it. Do adults do it?
No?
Good answer. They do not. I'm not sure why children do it. Did you get a sense of why children do it? And I got the sense that we outgrow it, but I'm not totally sure why children do it. Does anybody have, did you find anything in there that I seem to have missed? I've listened to this many times. I don't get it. Why do they do it?
What I understood, I think the way I understood it, he was basically saying kind of like how like our brain is made up so that we can recognize faces in different positions. So that's kind of we as children, we kind of do the same with letters.
Right.
And we generalize basically because that's kind of, I guess, for the evolution of recognizing faces, it's important. So it's kind of generalized to when we're learning how to read, that I guess you write, I guess, either left or right because you can recognize, I guess, the letters at that point from left to right. But then we outgrow it when we're taught like the differences between letters like B, D, and yeah. So we kind of
Yeah, that was
generalize.
a very, Jocelyn, that was a really good explanation. Yeah, it's an explanation of why we do it was really good. And that's exactly what he said. And I think that we outgrow it. And for some reason we outgrow it, probably because of the amount of information we start processing in terms of letters and so forth. I am not totally sure about that one. Then what did we think in terms of about the cognitive competition, right? About the recognition of words and faces. Did we lose anything, or what happens when we learn to read in terms of our recognition of faces? What happens?
He doesn't necessarily state that we lose the ability to recognize faces, just that like we lose the amount of literal brain space that is reserved for that. And so there is some competition there, but he doesn't go as far as saying that we're necessarily hurt by that, or, that we can't recognize faces as well. Although that is.
Wait, you muted yourself. Is that even what? Unmute yourself.
Although it is implied that we may not be able to recognize faces as well because there is less space in the cortex dedicated to
and
that,
it shifts to the right. Once again, we're talking about shifting functions over to the right, which happens, of course, when there are what's the word, injuries, right? There are certain injuries where if there's an injury on in one hemisphere, that function will be shifted to the other hemisphere. So that's not unprecedented as something that would happen. And perhaps this is a big perhaps, the brain may experience this neuronal recycling as kind of an injury, right? Because this hijacking of neurons may in fact play out. You can see how the brain might see, oh, wait, those aren't being used the same way anymore. That may be processed as some kind of, not injury, but let's just say like a less than, right? A reduction of accuracy, perhaps. I don't know. And yes, he would never say that because that would really be a downer for his particular theory, right? If his theory says that we lose the ability to recognize faces, you better believe that's going big nowhere. So, and people are going to stop reading all over the world. But but nonetheless, he does talk about adults, and we really saw that adults could experience the anatomical changes. And again, the changes in the brain's anatomy as a result of learning to read is, again, just a major, it's a hypothesis, but to posit such a thing is really the opening of a field of study of how culture affects the brain, right? How cultural objects affect the brain. And he went forward, he was talking about math and art and music, and okay, but I would have to see a little more research on that one, because music has kind of an evolutionary basis to it. So I'm not sure about that one. So if you come away, do you think you come away from this video with a better sense of how complex learning to read is, and the brain, how the brain specializes for it, right? Do you think you do?
Yeah, but I also have a lot more questions.
That's exactly how research should be, right? They always say good theory or good hypothesis is that which promotes more research, right? And so when you come away with more questions, they have in fact done what they're supposed to do. Because if they've given you just enough information for you to ask a question, that's how knowledge grows. Simply, yeah, that's how knowledge grows. Yeah, Yvette.
For me, I kind of, before the video, I kind of didn't really put into perspective the neurological side of it, like how the brain works, for reading. Because when you started mentioning about writing, I was thinking, because at my job, we use this website to assess the children. But then I'm like, wait, but sometimes some of the things we have here don't really, like a baby can't, I don't think a baby could do this, could do that. But now my brain is sort of programmed like, okay, maybe a baby can do this, can do that. Especially like the writing or like reading. That's I'm like reading. I'm like, I mean, the children I teach toddlers, they read because they look at the book, they open it and then just gaze it. I consider that reading. Others might not, but yeah, I think it also like depends on exposure too. And like I tell my parents, like, mommy, if you don't know how to read the book, so we give you, mommy, just read what the picture tells you. What is the bunny doing? What is it doing? Mommy, that's reading. You don't have to know how to read words, because the families we serve in the Bronx area, by 149th and 3rd Avenue, they're really like below poverty level line. And mostly parents are just trying to survive, trying to meet ends meet, and they sometimes don't have time to do it or rely on their older children to do it. So I'm like, mom, do what you can, and that's it. That's it.
I think, but you remind me of Bruner's work, right? So Bruner's work clearly says that you go from that iconic stage where they are just looking at the pictures and interpreting the pictures, and then from there is where you go to the symbolic stage, and the symbolic stage is about words. So, what you're describing sort of fits that very well, that model, very well. Anybody else? We have 1 minute. All right.
I have one.
Oh,
I was wondering.
There's two. All right. Kelly first and then Carolina.
I was just thinking if anyone else remembers how they were like taught reading when they were younger, because I was like watching it and then I was like, the only thing I remember is given like a little cutout box and like following the words. And it honestly, I'm not a great reader. Like it wasn't very helpful, but I was wondering if anyone else like remembers like how they were taught reading, because it's significant.
It is.
It showed me that.
That's interesting. Yeah, it is significant. It is. All right, Carolina, what was yours?
it's not really a question. It's more of a statement. I just want to like add to Kelly's question. The way I was kind of taught to read was like how to write my name, I guess. So, because my name is pretty long. As a kid, like you don't like say like Carolina. It's like 8 letters. So that's the way I guess I was taught to read. I also wanted to ask, it's not really a question, it's a statement. I believe that if children are exposed to more reading and writing, especially at the age of like from 3 to 5, it'll be more easier. So like down the line when they go to school and like, like middle school and whatever, they have like a certain reading level that they can, like apply or adapt to in a sense. I don't know.
Well, that's absolutely true. And I think that goes with what Yvette was talking about. If parents have the time to do that exposure,
That's true.
then kids do have a step, you know, like a step up from that. Now, let me just, there's so much going on in chat that I want to share. Erica was talking about, I was given tracing exercises. That's interesting. And then we had to arrange, what was it? We had to arrange them in sentences and read them back. I'm not sure what that was. Brandon said, I only remember being given a child version of the Bible, but I don't really remember how I was taught to read. Yeah, I got a child version of the Bible with lots of pictures. You know, that was a lot of pictures. And then Nicole mentions that she learned phonetically, which I believe I was in the time of phonetics too. I think I learned to read from phonics, right? Sounds.
And actually, my daughter's 4.5 now, so I'm in the process of kind of teaching her to do some reading stuff by sounding things out a lot. She does a lot of mirror writing, so a lot of this is just really peeking, like I'm seeing it happen in real time. I think I'm going to do that little test with her with the dots that he mentioned, and I'll tell you guys next class what happens. Be interesting to see.
Sounds good. Sounds good. So great questions. Great questions. And, you know, I wish we could, I really can't remember that. I'm going to work on that, Kelly, because I'm like, it was a while back. Let me just, you know. All right. So have a good weekend. I will see you on Tuesday. Hey, maybe we'll have a president. Anyway.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye. See you Tuesday.
See you Tuesday.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.